Got Next podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Excited to be here again. My name is Miles Richardson, and I'm here with
Isaac Sladen, and we are here for You've Got Next.
Yeah.
Stop 6.
Stop
right?
6.
We're here.
Stop 6. We're going through the Wayfinding Bible Flyover plan, and this is Stop 6 through that. Super excited because we are on another big story here. You know, if you were with us last time, we looked at a man named Abram came into the picture. And we saw that God does kind of a wild thing, something that would have been crazy in the eyes of Abram, because God comes to Abram and makes this covenant, this promise. And we see in the covenant and promise, there's a promise of land. There's this blessing aspect to it. There's also a promise of a son.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is, like, Abram and his wife Sarai are getting kind of old at this point. And so when we pick back up, we see that God comes to Abram and he does something, again, kind of interesting. He says, Abram, I'm going to change your name, actually. Yeah. We're switching this name from Abram to Abraham. And I think there's some significance to that.
Yeah, for sure. That's going to be the area that we're going to be in today with these name changes and this promised son that's going to come onto the scene here. And Abram changes his name to Abraham, which goes from Abram means exalted father to his new name, Abraham, meaning father of many. And God changes his name because he changes his destiny. Yeah. He's going to change the course of his life.
That's good.
And this story I think is kind of funny because it kind of relates to me just a little bit, because in just a little bit we'll talk about their son and his name and what that means.
Yes.
But this is always a story that I think is super cool to look at. And once again, we're able to look at how God is faithful and how he may work in different ways than what we may want him to or what we want it to look like. But he keeps his promises to us for sure.
Yeah. And we see, like you said, there's multiple name changes here. We come up on another big one. We see Abram gets his name switched to Abraham. And then we see God says, hey, I'm also going to switch your wife's name from Sarai to Sarah. But that's when he comes in and takes this promise of the son that now Abraham is going to get, right? He's going to get this son. But Abraham's thinking like, man, I'm getting old. Is this going to be like a son I'm maybe supposed to, what's the plan here, God?
Do you do?
And God, with this name change, kind of solidifies like, hey, you're going to have a kid and it's going to be with your wife, Sarah. That's kind of like that. It's just so distinguished and it brings Sarah into the picture and God puts emphasis on her as well. And it's just really important to see that God brings Sarah into the plan in a significant way as well.
For sure. One of the things I think is cool to note in the Wayfinding Bible, they give you a few different types of observation points, exploration points, kind of summaries for the pages that we're gonna read through. And one of the observation points I thought was interesting was it says this: people's names were sometimes changed when they had a life-changing experience. And so we're gonna see that here in this story, that God is gonna change their life. He's gonna change the course of their life for his glory, for sure. And that was just such a cool connection there that I had seen it, but it kind of clicked when I read that. And so that was a cool thing to see there. And then another thing that we're gonna see here in this story, which is a topic that probably is not in a lot of people's daily vocabulary.
Right.
But for real, like, it's an important thing to know in this story because it carries throughout the whole stories of the whole Bible and different topics. And it's the topic of circumcision, which is introduced in this story. So Miles, what does that kind of like mean whenever it comes to the context of this story and like people who are following God?
Yeah. So you're right. It's maybe not something we talk about all the time. And yet there's so much significance placed on it, specifically in this story. And so you're like, what is that about? Why is there significance on something that seems so weird, so out there? But here's what God comes in and says. He says, hey, this circumcision that I'm asking you to do is going to be a mark, a physical mark on your body to show that you believe that I'm going to do what I've said I'm going to do, that you're within the covenant. And here's the thing, though, is like, you've got to believe what God said is true. You got to believe that God's going to keep that promise, that covenant is something that God's going to hold to
for sure
before you're going to go and get circumcised. And so it's so interesting. You're right. Circumcision comes into the play, and we see that kind of throughout the Bible as a sign, a mark on your body of belief. And yet we see that it's like, hey, you've got to believe first, and then that mark's going to come after. And I think that's so important when we look into what the importance of why circumcision comes into the story here.
For sure. It could be an easy thing to fly over, but it's definitely important to get context for this but also other stories down the road as well. Okay, so the next thing that we see is that their son, Isaac, comes into the scene, which relates to me because my name is Isaac. And that name means laughter. This name means laughter. So, Miles, why does this name mean laughter? What do we see here in this story?
We see that Sarah gets this promise of like, hey, you're going to have a kid. And she like laughs when she hears that. She's like, I'm so old. Like my life is about to come to an end, at least in her
whenever
eyes.
I read this story, it's like, oh, God, like I don't know if I could imagine myself, God telling me something and then I laugh. Like immediately after to what he's telling me to do. Like that takes some like guts.
I can kind of picture it because I have a 2-year-old right now. And if God came to me and said, hey, when you're 100 years old, you're going to have another 2-year-old, I'm laughing. I'm laughing. Like that sounds like God's pulling a joke on me. And that's kind of where she came to this is like, are you sure? Like I'm about to have a kid right now. You know how old I am. And she laughs. And so, what we see is Isaac is born absolutely as God has promised. There's that laughing moment, and that's why he gets the name. But ultimately, Isaac is born, and that's why he can have that name is because Sarah laughed, and then he's born, and then she's like, all right, I'm gonna, that's his name. Is laughter, is Isaac, which is so cool. I'm sure you relate to that in a cool way.
And it's cool to see this story, but like many others, how God works in unique ways to show people that he does keep his promises, that he will fulfill what he's going to say, which is such a cool thing to see. So we always end with a question. And so Miles, I'll ask this question to you and we can kind of go back and forth. The question is this: what does Abraham and Sarah having a baby at 190 years old tell you what God can do today?
So like, Abraham's 100 and Sarah's 90, and it seems like there's just no way a kid's coming out of this story. Old. It seems like the door is closed on that. And yet God has a plan that even though it maybe doesn't make sense, it doesn't look right, it doesn't sound right, it's easy to not believe it. It's what happened because God said it. It happened. The promise was fulfilled. And so what I think the emphasis really comes to in our life is like to remember that God moves in crazy ways that just doesn't always seem to make sense. God has a plan. And sometimes we're sitting there and we're like, all right, God, like, I know this is what you've said. It's clear that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. But when I look around, the other people are telling me maybe that doesn't sound right. It's looking like it's not lining up in my life right. And yet it's just so, it brings so much hope, I feel like, into our lives to be like, hey, when my plan doesn't seem like it's making sense, neither did Abraham and Sarah's plan.
Neither did theirs.
A kid in the old age was not the play they were looking for until God kept that promise. And it worked out.
For sure. I love how you said whenever we see a plan that maybe we have or what we want to have happen isn't working out, it does bring hope. It does bring faith. It does bring like just so much, honestly, joy thinking about maybe things that have happened in my life or something I'm worried about in the future. Okay, it may not be working out how I wanted or envisioned, but God works differently than we do. And whenever God speaks and he moves, things happen. And so we just have to trust that promise and trust that he's going to move and just have faith in him. For sure.
Yeah, really and I love that we saw Abraham's destiny change, and it just makes me wonder, like, what change does God have in store for me in my life, and maybe for you guys as you're listening in your life? Just a question to kind of contemplate as you're reading through this story.
What's the next step? God's calling you to that could maybe change the course of your life for something that you may have thought, there's no way God could use me in this way or do that. Maybe he can. Maybe he wants to. So that's a great other question to ask as well. So that's the end of Stop 6 here. Thank you so much for watching and listening to our podcast. If you haven't already, like, subscribe, comment, share this with a friend. And we're just excited to be here, and we'll see you guys next time.
Looking forward to it.
Oh yeah.